I'll let PJ start.
Oh, okay. Even before first starting to play taiko was like all the um, social changes that were happening all around, all the events that were turning our heads to question, you know, like the morality of the Vietnam War. So anti-war movement is also coming out of time of free speech movement, civil rights movement, the beginning of Asian American studies or ethnic studies on campus and having to fight for visibility and also to tell our histories, to be a part of our community. Um, and yeah, that was what we were couched in, surrounding us. And also the beginning of uh, focus community organizing within Asian American communities, more specifically Japanese American community. And it was all spurred on from anti-war movement to um, Asian American studies. You know, it wasn't all scholastic. It was about community organizing, how to serve the community. So that's what we were, that was the era.
Okay, so I guess for me to answer that question is actually kind of looking at it a little bit historically. So if you don't mind, I'm just gonna actually go back much further than when we first started Taiko. And so, because I just have to, I feel that it's really kind of looking at what happened historically to Japanese American community beforehand, or what was happening in our country beforehand, and and within that context as being Asian American or Japanese American. And so, for us in San Jose, Japantown, you know, San Jose, Japantown started in 1890, basically. And so this year it's celebrating, what, 130 years as a Japantown. And so that's kind of significant. And I like to also say that, you know, when you look at when the actual uh, three recognized Japantowns, or there's four now, but primarily Little Tokyo and Nihonmachi, San Francisco, and San Jose, Japantown, the actual physical Japantowns, San Jose is the oldest one of the three. People don't realize that, you know, that San Jose, Japantown started just before the others did physically as where it's located. LA and San Francisco, there were actually Japanese probably there beforehand, before San Jose was, but they didn't centralize or create the Japantowns at that time. So for us, it's really kind of looking at that fact, and then looking historically what had happened to the Japanese, you know, with like the 1913 and 1928 California Alien Law Land Acts were prevented, first mainly the Chinese and the Japanese, but the 1920 law was specifically trying to target the Japanese from being able to buy their own land, or even lease land at that point. And so I guess for me personally, you know, I'm just kind of speculating in a way, but my grandparents, both my father and my mother's parents, you know, they had immigrated to the U.S. and they came in about the between somewhere around 1910 and 19 yeah, right after the, you know, beginning of the century at that point. And so they were in the U.S. when those land laws were being passed, basically, and then they decided to go back to Japan. And so I'm assuming it was because they just discovered they just couldn't do what they thought they could do, buy land, and do the farming or whatever they wanted to do. And so they basically returned to Japan, and that's why my parents, both my parents, mother and father, although they didn't know each other, their families didn't know each other at the time. They were both born here in the U.S. And then since their families are going back, they all went back to Japan. And so both my parents are Kibei because they were basically raised in Japan from all their elementary through high school schooling. And then my father was sent back first, and this is just before World War II was starting to happen. Japan was starting to do their, you know, trying to take over the world at that point. And so I guess since my father was technically an American citizen, although living in Japan, and only speaking Japanese, was sent back to the US because I'm assuming my grandparents were a little bit fearful that he would be drafted and sent off to the war, basically. And so, and then shortly afterwards, my mother was sent over here, kind of like a picture bride. It was an arranged marriage to marry my dad. And this was happening, my dad came first, and then my mother came. She came just before World War II broke out. I think it was in 1939. And so she was sent over here. And so, you know, kind of sets up what happened to my parents at them. Naturally, right when the war broke out, they were relocated, interned, when the internment happened. And so, and they were put into Topaz in Utah. But again, you know, since they were Kibe, they were only speaking Japanese pretty much. They hardly spoke English at all. So for them, it was really kind of difficult. Then when in August 6, 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, it was, for me, you know, naturally, I wasn't born yet, but just looking back, you know, that must have been a really hard time for my parents because my grandparents, both my father and mother's parents, lived in Hiroshima. And so from the stories we had heard, especially from my mother's side, my grandfather or my mother's father, right after the bomb was dropped, went into the center city of Hiroshima looking for friends and relatives. I never met my mother's father and mother, my grandparents on that side. I was told they both passed away from cancer in the early 1950s, shortly after I was born. And I never put it together, but basically it was probably from the radiation of the fact that they were in Hiroshima and went looking for relatives right after the bomb was dropped. And so when I started to learn about all these different things, naturally, it just kind of naturally spurred my interest or questioning of what I was as far as being Japanese American. Again, my parents, who were primarily Japanese speaking and Kibe, you know, naturally really wanted to kind of continue their heritage of being Japanese or their Japanese culture in that way. So they're encouraging and doing things within that context. But at the same time wanting us, all the kids, to be pretty much Americanized, you know. My oldest brothers are both born in a camp in Topaz. And they both were born, when they were born, they both only had a Japanese first name, no English name at all. And I was the third one to be born in the family out of 5. And I was the first one given an English name as my first name. So my middle name is Japanese, but my first name is English. So, and so that was kind of saying my parents were trying to set us supposedly like on to assimilate and be Americanized, basically, and understanding that that was really kind of important for us to do that at that time. So growing up for me, it was really kind of in this really mixed situation, you know, plus the fact that we were living in Oakland, East Oakland, which was predominantly a Black neighborhood, and just kind of seeing the stuff that was going on around that time. You know, there was naturally hearing about Martin Luther King, you know, the civil rights movement. 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was passed. At that time, I was in junior high school, basically. And so in 1964, when that Civil Rights Bill was passed. And so in 1966, I was moving from junior high school to high school. And my parents, my counselor was telling me that I should go to this other high school in Oakland versus the one I was really lived close to. And said that that was probably a better school for me. It had a little bit better music program, which I was into at the time. And he just thought academically I'd probably do really well there. And so my parents naturally agreed to that. I didn't realize that basically what was happening then was Oakland was desegregating the schools. So this school I was sent to was up on the hill. I had to take a bus every day back and forth. It was predominantly an all-white school versus the high school I would have gone to, which was going to be predominantly Black school. And so just being involved in that whole situation in Oakland. In 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, you know, Oakland kind of erupted into chaos at that point. And it was really kind of awakening for me because here I was at this pretty much an all-white school with a busload of people of color, kids of color, like me, primarily Black students. Very few Asians were being bused up there. But and having to realize that we had to come down the hill on a bus that was going to go right past the high school that was all Black that we were supposed to go to in order to get back home, basically. And so it was really kind of for us just trying to figure out, what was going to happen on our ride home that day or during that whole period of time. And it was just, just understanding that that was all what was really kind of going on around us at that time. There, just prior to that, the Black Panther Party was organizing in East Oakland. They were just a few blocks away from where we lived. It was, for me at that time, it was just seeing them drive around, knowing who they were, and it was very obvious, who they were, and all those kind of things. Earlier, also during that time, what was happening at Berkeley was a free speech movement. In 1968, also was the Third World Strike that happened at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State, which started the Asian American Studies, the Ethnic Studies programs. And then also, I guess in 68 was the, I guess that's when Tommy Smith and John Carlos, was in the Olympics in Mexico. And after they won their event, they both raised their fists in the Black Power symbol. And so, and actually were criticized for that and given a tough time. That to me was also kind of significant because that was happened in 1968. I graduated high school in 69 and came down to San Jose State. And those two were San Jose State track stars, basically. So they're part of the San Jose State track team. So it was kind of interesting all this was happening. Actually, the anti-war movement was happening at that same time. And just coming down to go to the college, right in the middle of this anti-war movement. Third world students are organizing to try to get ethnic studies programs going on campus. It was in some ways chaos as far as education was concerned, but it was also an amazing experience to be involved in all these different things that was going on at the same time. And so, and then realizing, how to get involved with these different things and to try to get, see what, how I kind of fit into that. I latched on to a group of folks who were just starting up the Asian American Studies program at San Jose State. And so got involved with that pretty quickly. And starting to get into that. And within that program, naturally, we were talking about, well, it's not only what the academics could do on campus, but it was also what we could be doing in the communities for us. And for us, naturally, at San Jose State, Japantown was a really close, community for us to be tying into. And so that's why we decided, students from San Jose State decided that it was important we start to do something within the community to really kind of engage in that way. And so creating an organization for Asian Community Action and starting to do community programming initially was at that same time, Kimochi was starting in San Francisco. There was a group in the East Bay, Berkeley area, which PJ was also involved with, and I was helping a little bit too with the seniors. And then we started one in San Jose, which kind of eventually became UI Chi basically later on. So, but those were kind of important things for us. It's really kind of understanding what, I guess, we didn't really call it activism at that time. I guess we called it more community organizing, because we just felt it was really important to do things to kind of help organize the community. And we also kind of felt that the best way to do that was not just to suggest things and offer things from the outside, but we had to be in the community to kind of do that. So a lot of us moved from San Jose State, moved into Japantown to actually live in the area to start doing that. In order to try to start these programs we wanted to do, which was like a senior program, legal aid services, which became the Asian Law Alliance in San Jose, and other different programs in order just to kind of service the community that didn't have those services, that we realized it did not have the services, whether it was Japanese seniors who were mainly men at that time, because only men were coming early on to Issei, and a lot of them were still primarily Japanese speaking, or the Filipino community who was right there, or the Chinese community who were that really started there in Japantown, to Highlandville before Japantown was started. So that kind of takes me in general. I mean, there's other stuff naturally was happening, especially at San Jose, because Cesar Chavez was organizing on campus. So there was that whole thing. The third world entity of just trying to start Asian American studies, the Black studies, and the Chicano studies at the end of the time, what they called it at that time, was really kind of unifying all the third world groups in order to come together in order to create those programs. And also just looking at how, not only the students on campus, but more importantly, how this community itself can be served in different ways.
I'd like to kind of add to that because of all the ethnic studies programs on campus, and it was like everything was surrounding that time of, still anti-war movement, but it's the time where people were trying to serve the community, because in those ethnic studies programs, there weren't all that many resources that are in books. Our histories weren't quite written yet. And the whole platform for ethnic studies was like, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And if you're just protesting against the war, hey, we have a war right in our neighborhoods. It's our people. So go and serve the people. And that was what Asian American Studies was for me. It was like a way to learn how to be a part of a community, to help build a community. And it wasn't all intellectual. It wasn't academics. It was like very community building. So that was the activism back then, but it was serve the people.
In different communities, as far as Asian American communities had their different issues going on. Los Angeles and San Francisco, the dominant one was redevelopment, tearing down of old buildings and big development corporations coming in and building things. That was happening in Chinatown, San Francisco. The I Hotel was a signature hotel that was in that situation. A lot of the issues that were being kind of raised around in the community was around land use and housing and service and care and social services and language issues. And so it was just a lot of different things that we were trying to address at the same time, so it was a little bit overwhelming sometimes, because how do you kind of do everything, or how do you figure out how to serve different people? It's not just the Japanese community with one language, but there was multiple languages and multiple people of different communities. And for us, especially in the Japantown area at that time, it still was kind of the Chinese community had kind of left, but there's still remnants of that naturally. The Filipino community was right there in the middle of it too. And then actually Japantown community was right there around it. So we were trying to deal with all of those three entities at that time. And so versus like San Francisco or LA, where it's really separated entities, actually physically separated communities, versus what we had in San Jose, which was, kind of unique, I think, because we really stood as an Asian community, so to speak, because we were all there in one spot. So for us, I guess it was really, again, to kind of the activism, I guess, if you want to call it that, again, I would say is more how we wanted to try to create programs and figure out what's the best way to do that. And so for me, one of the other avenues or entities I thought was really necessary was to be working with the Buddhist church and working with the temple, because that was one of the largest community entities in Japantown. And so, so I became involved with the church and started working. And at that time, Reverend Hiroshi Abiko came in and was just starting there. And so I actually was hired on by the church, actually by the Buddhist Churches of America, BCA, the headquarters, to be what they call a regional or coast district youth director. And so when I started to do that, it was basically, the assignment was to help try to encourage more youth to become active in the churches. And that was working with the YBA, the Young Buddhist Associations, mainly junior and senior ones, And so I was assigned to the district, which included from Mountain View down to Salinas, Monterey, Morgan Hill, Gilroy, and actually San Jose. And so again, it was looking at it, how can I really kind of organize within these different temples and different youth groups to try to get them active in different ways. And so I was trying to get them in, especially San Jose chapter here, to get more involved with what's happening in Japantown in general, with some of the things that were starting up, the senior outings that was being held for this Issei, the seniors, or some of the other activities around. But naturally, a lot of us, it was really kind of focused around the temple itself, what was going on with that, getting more involved with Obon or whatever it was. But and then that's when Hiroshi Abiko decided or suggested, so why don't we bring Taiko in to try to encourage the youth to come back in and do something. And actually, that was, for me, was, I didn't know anything about Taiko, really. I've seen it during Obon time. Kind of saw San Francisco Taiko Dojo, which was already established and playing in this area. But we kind of knew the Hinata folks who were already playing. And so we decided to ask them to kind of help and do things. And so I got into it thinking, well, one, for me personally, it was an interest because it was a Japanese instrument. It was a musical instrument, which I still love to do as far as music. It was tied to my culture and heritage, being Japanese and Japanese American. And it was, I saw it as initially a great way, a great organized community organizing tool to bring the youth back to the temple. And so it was, I think, different from a lot of people when they got into Taiko. They thought of it as a cultural thing and maybe a music thing and a fun thing, and also looking at it as an organizing tool. And so just to try to get people back engaged, basically. And then realizing musically it is fun. So it was, having a great time at the same time. So so I was approaching to start Taiko in a very different perspective than I think other folks were.
For myself, I will relate to how I was inspired by Chris and Joanne, Chris Ijima and Joanne Miyamoto. And so this is like the early 70s, and they were going around all the Asian American communities from the East Coast to Chicago to the West Coast, LA, San Francisco, and they were the first Asian American troubadours, folk singers to write music about our history, to write music about social justice, to hear music framing my life, my history, this body, going, wow, they're singing about me. And it was a very uplifting type of experience to see people from all, I would say, radical students and people, community organizers, coming to watch a performance and then feeling very inspired, and at the very end getting up and dancing, like a tankobushi rock. And I just remember that becoming more the embodied memory of like that change and joy at the same time, seeing people who are very much community organizers, and at the same time they're feeling a different kind of movement. It's a different movement, and it's through self-expression. It's through music. It's hearing our stories in a different way. And that's what inspired me. That's what I remembered. And then when I came to San Jose and saw the beginning of Taiko, I felt the same very seed of energy that also was more than music. It was something that was like, I have to do that. And I know that this too is a way to organize people. This is a way for people to share values, or even at that time, we were still searching. We were still looking for what um, identity, um, community, um, and our place, our purpose. Um, and for me, I said, wow, this Japanese American art form really is um, helping me understand who I am as a Japanese American. Because before I graduated from Berkeley, I had gone through Asian American Studies, and then I wanted to go to Japan because I never experienced my Japanese cultural heritage. So I went to Japan for 1 year and thinking, oh, my people are going to learn about my culture. And that's where I found out that I was not Japanese. That culture was not mine. And yet, the culture that I thought I grew up in America, I was never accepted, always felt marginalized. But coming back from Japan experience and going, wow, I'm marginal over here and marginal over there. And then coming and to San Jose to get into urban planning, a master's program at San Jose State, I came upon the beginnings of San Jose Taiko. And that was where, oh, yeah, the first few years of being involved in that is like, I'm defining myself. We're defining ourselves. Nobody's telling us who to be or who to copy. And that's when I felt like unmarginalized and really finding that very confident, asserted place. So I felt that that's how actually living and experiencing and exploring, that's what it takes to understand how you connect. And that in itself is, I would say, now you would say that's kind of like a activism. It's getting yourself into situations where you are actually exploring with each and building with each other.
Yeah, so to add to that, I guess, is once we got involved doing Taiko, I think those of us, and a lot of the initial members were coming from San Jose State, somewhat involved with Asian American Studies, or haven't taken classes, or everyone was basically, I think, was searching for their identity, which is why Taiko at that time really attracted different people. And so, and actually people kind of, we had no real structure to the group, so people kind of came and went. There was no requirements to join. You just showed up. If you wanted to play, here's your bachis, you know, go ahead and jump on. And but once we started to establish the group a bit, and we were realizing, you know, that there was after actually, I guess, spending some time with San Francisco Taiko Dojo, Seiji Tanaka, and learning some of the fundamentals through him, and then the discipline that naturally he was using to run his group and things, and then trying to understand also what we were trying to do, because we had started already writing our own music from the most very beginning. So, and we had some really talented people in the group initially to help do that. So realizing that we wanted to really create our own voice, our own sound, own style, and also realizing at that time that this could be the Japanese American voice that we never had, the Taiko could be. And how we played, specifically how we, San Jose Taiko, could play it, could be truly that Japanese American voice. Because our experience was primarily as Taiko Dojo was Tanaka Sensei from Japan, so it was a festival drumming coming from Japan. Knowing Kinara was coming out of from the Buddhist, you know, the Senshin temple, and so having that the Buddhist perspective on why they play. They actually had a very strong community sense too, but it was really focused on the temple too. And so for us, we were coming really from a Japanese American, Asian American perspective. And so, and realizing too that the Taiko, for those being involved, was really a musical and an instrument that was empowering for everyone, especially women. And we had primarily more women than men playing with the group from the very beginning. And so, and also it was a sense of self-identity and cultural identity for people. And so that's what drew people together, really, to kind of identify with that. And not everyone was Japanese or Japanese American, but still it was that cultural identity of being Asian and Asian American and working together within that context. And so we felt that, we were building sort of, I guess, within that sense, a voice that could be a powerful voice actually for not only the Japantown, but just the community in general, as far as representing Asians in general. Because up to that point, actually, when people talked about Asian music or specifically Japanese music, it was really kind of the stereotypical classical, things that that Americans here were portraying, basically. So the taiko was something out of norm that they just not know what was, what to be expected out of that. So we were just changing perspectives rapidly when we started to play, because people just didn't know how to kind of treat us or what that meant. And so it took us a long time actually to kind of convince people that we were sort of authentic, if you want to say, as an art form. And so we were realizing early on, if we wanted to continue as a group and really do something, and we got incorporated in order to try to pursue that it would take a lot of education of people around us in order to make that happen, primarily funders. And so so that was the challenge for us. So if you want to call that activism, basically it was going out to kind of not only as Taiko, but also realizing that we needed to stand up and be unified with other multicultural arts groups in the San Jose area in order to make that statement that the multicultural art scene was just as important as the symphony, the ballet, the opera, or any of these other Western perspectives of art and music, basically. San Jose, when we were trying to get funding from them, they called themselves, the funding source was the Fine Arts Commission. And so that title alone just kind of eliminated any possibility for us, in a sense, because they just did not understand what we were and how we would fit into their definition of music and art. And so we felt for us, it was really trying to go out and educate different people in order to make that statement and understanding. So working at the city level, then eventually trying to go after state council, arts council money to do that also there. And also after that, going after National Endowment for the Arts to try to make them understand too. It was interesting because, naturally when we were going before these different funding sources or other people, they would look at us and say, well, you're more world music. And so we would ask, well, world music, what does that mean? Isn't everybody world music here then? Even the opera and symphony is world music, right? But, they just had their perceptions of what that meant. And basically, it got further somewhat defined for us, because then we're being classified as folk and traditional arts. And so, and actually we really tried to fight that term, because although that was what we kind of fell into as far as categories, we never really felt we were a folk and traditional art form, because we were so contemporary. Because here, in America, they're calling us folk and traditional, and in Japan, they're calling us non-traditional and renegades. So, so where do we fit? We didn't fit anywhere, depending on who you talk to, basically. And so that was our problem, because neither side really wanted us, basically. And so if you want to call it activism, I think our mission, what we were trying to do early on, was trying to educate the larger population about what taiko is all about and how it represents the Japanese American community. And it's different. It can be different than what you hear, traditionally as far as Asian music is concerned. But I think we were also trying to say that I felt what was important for me too, is that we were trying to say we were different from what was happening in Japan, that we were creating our own sound here that was unique to being Japanese American and here in the US. And so I've always felt that the North American taiko scene really kind of stood on its own, has naturally strong connections to Japan in many different ways, but musically has kind of stood on its own. We've taken a lot of criticism for doing that, perhaps, you know, just creating our own sound and creating, because we're being told our music was too complicated, you know, because, you know, you don't play in 5/4, 7/4, or 9/4 rhythm patterns, you know, you don't use other instrumentation like the cowbell or any other kind of non-Japanese instruments. And so, but with all that, you know, we had to do what we felt was important for us musically and artistically. And it's a complete turnaround, what you see in Japan now, what they're doing versus what we started to do, you know, almost 48 years ago now. So it's just interesting that we had to struggle through all that basically during that whole time in order to create, I guess, what I feel now is the taiko outside of Japan's look.
But it's not only just the art, the way that we expressed it, it was also how we organized ourselves within the group. It was a completely different structure. We did not have a sensei, so there was not a hierarchy, nor did we ever feel like we wanted to, because we came from grassroots community organizing. And it was like how to level the playing field and basically how to be more lateral than hierarchical. So it was really pulling all of our strengths together in order to realize that we are an operating entity. And that in itself was like really different than sensei type of group, or yeah, anything that was top down. And we were trying to find a different way of operating ourselves and empowering ourselves, creating the leadership, and also realizing that we have to be both leader and follower in a very respectful way, and taking that responsibility. And I think what we try to do philosophically is that what we do inside the group is also something that we also want to create outside. That it's not a standalone group thing that you practice, but you practice these principles and values outside as well. So very holistic. Well, for sure, a larger movement, you know. I would say that our earlier years, it was like trying to establish who we are, who we were in terms of our community, in terms of building taiko, making ourselves visible, you know. And there were a lot of social events at that time that spurred us to be able to make entry points. And I think with everything that's happening now, these are entry points for the next generation. So it's like a lot more awareness of cultural, multicultural expression and people, you know, coming together that was not there. It was more singular based before. Now it's more inclusive of everybody expressing solidarity a lot more. That's what I see now, and that's exciting. And it's exciting to see that we are being challenged with at a time that, you know, with COVID and everything else, it's like how to be creative. And I think that's the exciting part, that people are searching and wanting and almost being like, I have to do this, have to do this. But it's at the same time calling people to call themselves inward to really find those values inside, and how is it coming together in solidarity with another in a very genuine way. How do we build together? And that's what I feel differently. It's not like we're trying to fight over the piece of the pie, who's going to get that. you know it's like, okay, yeah, we've got to make this happen if we really want the world to change, if we want to live in the world that we want to live in. We have to be a part of making that happen. And I feel that's a momentum a lot greater. I just hope that it's able to sustain itself. Um, there's definitely a lot more awareness, a lot more awakening, people asking questions. Um, so, yeah, I think there's a lot more informed individuals kind of coming together.
I've been kind of thinking about, when I saw your question, I was trying to think about what that really means for me, because I guess looking back to like the 60s and the early 70s, when a lot of organizing, especially around the anti-war and also the ethnic studies stuff that was starting to develop, there was a different kind of solidarity being developed at that time. The white liberals naturally were leading the anti-war movement and stuff. So Asians were involved in the anti-war movement because none of the people my age, because we were all draft eligible at that time, we didn't want to go to Vietnam or Cambodia to fight a war as an Asian. And so there was that segment of stuff that was happening. You didn't see really a lot of Black or Latino folks, support. They would support the anti-war issues, but they were not as vocal in a sense, because they didn't have, to me at that time, for the war, the anti-war stuff, an investment of that kind in a sense. So what became the solidarity thing was, the ethnic studies and trying to create that kind of atmosphere on campus, and that's what brought the Black, brown, and Asian students together, basically to work together. We were pretty much forced to work together in order to make it, because we had to understand and realize that without that, we would not, any of us would get anything, just by ourselves. And so we realized that in order to get anything, we needed to work as a solid block. And so that's where the unity of people of color really began at that point, I feel. I kind of feel over the years, it has kind of diminished. And at the same time, there's actually different kinds of issues. It's kind of come and gone, but nothing as big as in that time period that was happening after that until now. Where even though like the race issues and the white supremacy issues have been decades old, centuries, old, no one was really, people would be talking about, but no one was really dealing with it until it seems like now it's on everyone's mind, and they're trying to interpret and fit in and figure out how they kind of deal with that. And so it's interesting just to be able to see how that has that's kind of spurred that kind of dialogue and interest, and I think it's really important, and it's good that people are talking and trying to figure out individually, and also I guess as groups, what does that all mean? How do you kind of fit in? How do you react to it, or do you react to it? What's your statement? What's your position? What's your stance? Are you out protesting, or are you out rioting? Are you the person that's stealing stuff from the stores, or what are you doing out there? So and so I think right now it's just an interesting time, because it's a mixed group of people. When you look at who's out there, it's a lot of younger people naturally, and that's what it was like again 50 years ago. It was mainly younger people out there protesting, and so it's a new generation of folks that are that's out there doing this. So recently I've been thinking more about the generational issues that have been going on. And so, you know, those, because we're holding our own focus groups, and one of the big questions was, you know, well, what's the difference between, say, like the baby boomers to the millennials, you know? And so, um, and we talk a lot about, you know, that those are two age groups that have really been kind of matched against each other. Um, but we kind of forget about the other ones, you know, who are kind of in between or after that, right? Like it's Gen Z, which is actually the group of folks, that's your collegiate Taiko group folks right now, actually. And we don't even talk about them, but they're the ones supposedly being active and doing stuff out there. And so, and I was trying to relate to the fact, well, it's really kind of similar when you look at the Issei, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei, and even now Gosei generations, because the value systems that kind of existed within the generations are kind of the same value systems to some extent that when you could relate it to the baby boomers on to the Gen Z, and so, or even the generations afterwards. So how does those value systems really kind of hold together or not hold together? And why did they kind of disintegrate at certain times and then come back into play? And so, and that's what kind of happened within the Japanese American community, you know, from the Issei to the Nisei. The older sanseis were becoming the activists, like what we've been talking about. The younger sanseis kind of slipped back into this more mainstream thing. And then, you know, after that, the Yonsei, I think I felt it was in that same mode because in a way, but now some of them are coming out and now the younger ones after that are kind of starting to move stuff a bit. So it's just trying to look at how that might, again, the value system that we hold or don't hold, and how are people interpreting those things, I think is really kind of important right now. For me right now is until until this thing started happening, you know, for someone to say, you know, even mention the word white supremacy, you're automatically labeled into, uh-oh, you're one of those really crazy radicals, you know, and you know, you don't like anybody type of thing, it's whatever, you know, but just using different terms and whatever, you know, just put you into a different kind of pigeonhole of perspective of how other people viewed you basically. And so what has happened, I feel, within the last even 5 months basically of time, or even 4 months time since a lot of this stuff started happening, people are using the term white supremacy so loosely now. It's just almost like, well, what does it really mean, you know? And to what extent, you know, how it doesn't have that shock value, basically, I feel, that it did before. So I don't know if that's good or bad, you know. It's good, I guess, that more people are willing to kind of say the word and then kind of talk about it in a sense, but I'm not quite sure if how they're interpreting that, or if they totally understand the historical context of what those words mean, and how really it, you know, has impacted us from again from a long time ago to now, and will still continue to do so if we're not able and willing to really get rid of things that are in place right now, and that includes people like our president, the KKK, you know, the far right, you know, how do we do that? I mean, because you know, the neo-Nazi system, how do we kind of do that? And some of that's tied into big business, and so which everyone will use and continue to use, you know, in banks, whatever, you know, funding sources. So and so that's what's, I think, you know, how do we people analyze to understand what all that means, other than just a sort of a so-called social political term that's on the surface that people are reacting to right now. And I think what's important for us is try to dig deeper into those things, and so that we as and I would have to talk more specifically, we as Asian Americans or Japanese Americans, you know, and so, and I know the Taiko community and this group that we're talking that's involved right now is a real mixed group, um, but we as Asian American and Japanese Americans really have to have a better understanding what that means, so that we're able to have a better way to answer, act, react, and move forward more positively than what we've been doing up to this point. And so that's what I'm hoping for. And so, and this is a great baby step, if you want to call it, because I feel now we have more people that are willing to kind of step out behind us or in front of us, hopefully, actually, because, we can't be out front like we've been in the past all the time. I'm hoping, and that's one of my hopes out of this session, is that other people are coming out of this to kind of step forward and be the leaders to do that. And I see, I recognize a lot of folks in the room that can definitely be that person, that leader. And so that's what I'm excited about right now.
It's really quite a interesting time, as Roy is talking about white supremacy, even talking about racism. I mean, just only a few years ago, we both came out of the American Leadership Forum, which is all about leadership, as a servant leader, and also just a different way of leading. And yet, within our class, only 5 years ago, we would talk about racism, and it was like people were not even ready or could not even begin to talk about this. And there were like two African Americans in our group, and a judge at that, a woman, and you can tell that there was this very angry part of her. It's like, why isn't that, we can't talk about this, and yet now we can. It's to be so, putting it in front of our faces now. We can't run away from it. I think that's the opportunity. That's the chance, and the condition that makes it possible to deal with trauma, to deal with things that have never been told truthfully about. It's like, this is the time of what people are saying is the reckoning. So to be able to come together and be so open to want to be informed, I think that's where I see people are open. Before, I was like business as usual, and I just go down and do this and this and this, but there was no urgency. The urgency is because we're still in COVID, and the urgency is all this other, rising, and it's, you can feel the momentum, you can feel the movement, and the opportunity is that we have to think differently, because we certainly don't want to carry on the systems that no longer work. So that's the opportunity now, is for us to all realize that if we don't want to go back to those systems that oppress, then we have to realize that it's only us as individuals. How do we come to the forefront in order to stand for the kind of life we want to live, to stand for the kind of systems that represent all, to work together, even in the microcosm of a Taiko group? How do we look at ourselves of how we contribute into the greater system, and how do we see ourselves being a part of, not outside of, but we are trying to create for the greater good. So I feel that that's what the opportunity is, because people are feeling this alertness. That's wrong. That's wrong. So if it's wrong, what is right? So we have to also stand up to show what is right.
It's always been such a struggle to get people to step up. I feel, for me, in the the work with Taiko basically, or I've been working a lot, especially the last couple of decades of time, basically trying to build a multicultural art scene too, especially locally here in San Jose, but just also nationally in a way. But how I feel the Blacks and the Latinos, have really kind of stepped up in that scene. The Asians have not. And so it's really kind of difficult to get that to happen. And then so Taiko falls in within that realm even further down the ladder when you talked about activists within the arts, within the Asian American art scene. And so for whatever reason, Taiko players view themselves more as just players, not activists. And so, how can they kind of see themselves as an activist within their community to help organize or bring forth the message somehow? Naturally, different people have their definitions of what that means and how they're kind of reacting to it. Some of the younger folks are really starting to step up, I feel, to do that. But others, have not. And so, sometimes I'm just disappointed again that when I see within the Taiko community, the dialogue is more, how can I practice better still when I'm at home and no drum versus, what's going on around here? What does that mean? So they're kind of not understanding what the bigger issue is going on around them. So they're just so kind of stuck on the fact that they can't practice. And so I just kind of feel sad about that.
Say that I find it for myself, this is an opportunity for me because after leaving San Jose Taiko, I've embarked on Taiko Peace. And even when I embarked on this path, it's like, what's that, PJ? Oh, what do you plan to do with that? And it's a different approach to looking at how to play Taiko with this awareness. What you do on stage should have equal value and impact of what happens off the stage. So that's why I try to integrate, how can I see developing that awareness of self a lot more through this practice of even peace culture, but it's also looking at how to build, raise consciousness, basically. That's basically what my path has been, is how to raise consciousness. And I feel that this is an opportunity for me and for many people who are looking and who desire to have some kind of shakeup, some kind of change, that we have to do things differently. Just don't fall back in what was, the way we used to, how we do. All the important things of what we do will find another way of being expressed even better if it's supposed to. I just feel like that's where the opportunity of really elevating the art form along with principles and values that we can practice and share and express and inspire and influence. I feel that that's what our work can be, our artistry can be. And that's what I'm very hopeful about. And that's what I'm very excited about.